Good morning. It's good to see you here this morning. Of course, we've got several visitors and we got several out of town, so we're hoping for everyone's safety. And we're also thankful, of course, that our visitors are here with us today. I encourage you to open up your hearts and open up your Bibles to the book of Ruth, and we'll pretty much be there the entire time. And I'll reference some other places as we go along. The book of Ruth, here right after the book of Judges. As many of you probably know, today is Mother's Day. And every time I say that, I like to look around, because every once in a while you'll get one person on Mother's Day, and they'll start whispering to someone else, but I didn't see anyone this morning. And of course, it's a day that, we think about our mothers, and, some argue that it was just made by the flower companies and the card companies to make more money. But it's still, of course, a great day to have to focus on our mothers. Ann and Terry and Laura, they're at the beach this weekend, so I'm going to be doing both sermons. And that was a Mother's Day gift from Ann, I believe. But it was okay because I got to hang out with my mother last weekend, and we did Mother's Day then. And this afternoon, I'll call her and I'll say, Happy Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day, Mom. And then she'll say, thank you, baby. And that'll be our conversation. But of course, with even in all that and that fun, which is great, and we should enjoy those things. But of course, Mother's Day, too, is also very difficult for some of us. Some of us that have lost our mothers, some of us that may have lost our spouses, or lost our children, and as our mother being the mother figure for them, that can be a difficult time. And I think when we think about those things and the mixed emotions we have about this holiday, Ruth is a great book to go to. Because Ruth is going to start with a woman that's going to be in that place of despair. And her mother-in-law, who's technically not even her mother-in-law anymore, is also in this place of despair. And these two women are going to have to help each other and take care of each other to survive. And what we see actually in the conclusion of Ruth is Ruth becomes a mother. That's the conclusion in the last verses there. We see the joy and the celebration of Ruth becoming a mother and who her children end up becoming as well. So let's look at Ruth this morning, if you would, with me. And I think if we just kind of walk through the story and make some points as we go along, we would benefit from this class, this lesson. I only got 4 points. And my first point is I just want to talk about who Ruth was. Secondly, I want to talk about Ruth's attitude towards Naomi. Then we're going to talk about, thirdly, Boaz being the redeemer of the story, and he has very much a shadow of Jesus Christ. And finally, we'll end up with Ruth's legacy and talk about Ruth becoming a mother and a great-grandmother to someone who's very important in the history of the Israelite nation. If we look at Ruth, if you look in chapter 1, verse 1, we see that Ruth is a Moabitess. She is from the country of Moab. That is her heritage. There's a famine in the land, and you have Naomi's husband and her 2 sons leave Judah where the famine's taking place to travel to Moab in hopes to find bread. And as they go there, Naomi's 2 sons end up meeting Ruth and Orpah, and they take them as wives. Both of them are Moabite women. We see it's in the time of the judges. Verse 1, chapter 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man from Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Being that she lived in the time of Judges, what kind of a period do you think this was? Was this a good period or a bad period? This would have been actually a very bad period, wouldn't it? And if you look just one page backwards, the very last verse of Judges chapter 21, verse 25, it gives us a little summary in one sentence. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So if you think about the play out that we're in here, we are probably in the worst time period of the Israelite nation ever. The time of the judges, no one follows God. Everyone does what's in their right eyes. And they go in and out of captivity constantly until these judges rise up to save them. And now we have a Gentile woman that's going to come in and she's going to be our hero. Which is really, really interesting when you think about it. As we go into this as well, being a Moabitess, there would be some connotations that we would make just by seeing the name Moab. Moab is rarely ever put in a positive light when we look in the Bible. And it's interesting that we don't remember her as this, but she was from Moab. Some things about Moab. Number one, Moab started because of the incestuous relationship between Lot and one of his daughters. right after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Many of you may remember that story in Genesis 19. It involves the daughter getting Lot drunk so that she can have his children, thinking she's the last person in the world. And when this happens, they have Moab, and Moab is the one that starts this nation. Is the nation of Moab off to a good start? No. And as we see throughout the history of Moab, it is filled of two things: drunkenness and harlotry. And that's what people usually associate when they think of Moab. The next time we see the nation is when Joshua and Moses are leading the people out. And then as they get into Numbers 25, we have the story of Balaam and Balak that tempt God to curse the Israelites. God refuses, so they have a different plan. And what they do is the women of Moab commit harlotry with the men of Israel. And in Numbers 25, we see that God destroys 24,000 with the plague because of the harlotry that they commit with Moab. As well, you look into other places, they're actually going to give you a larger number of how many people died in that plague later. So again, if we're an Israelite and we're reading the book of Ruth and we see that she's a Moabitess, what are we thinking about Moab? We're not thinking anything good. The next place we see in Moab is in Judges when King Eglon, if you remember, because he was the fat king, he takes the people of Israel into captivity, and Ehud, who's left-handed, we remember the story, he hides his sword, he goes in and he stabs King Eglon, the Moabite king, and he ends up losing his sword because he's so fat. But even then, when we think about Moab, we think about the fat King Eglon and all the things that he did wrong and how he had to be killed by the judge Ehud. So there's all these stories that we come, and they're all negative about Moab until we get to Ruth. Because Ruth's going to be from Moab, but she's going to do great things. Instead of remembering her as the Moabitess, we remember her as the one who gave the greatest expression of love recorded in the Bible. And of course, I put that right underneath John 15 when Jesus says that I'm going to give my life for my friends. But here we remember Ruth as the one who told Naomi, your people, my people, your God, my God, wherever you go, I'll go. That's who we think about when we think about Ruth. Even though Ruth had everything going against her, she did not let her heritage or her background or the things that happened in her life get in her way of doing right. And that's the very first point I want to make here. Does it matter who your parents are? Does it matter where you came from? Does it matter the situation you're in? It doesn't. You are defined by the choices and the decisions that you make. And Ruth is a living example of that for us today. And so when we get into the world and we get caught up in sin, we get caught up in using wrong language and having inappropriate relationships, and all these things happen, and then we say, well, I'm just like this because my parents were like this. Well, I'm just like this because in the house that I grew up, this is what was going on and this was why. Is that a real excuse? When we read books like Ruth, we can't make those excuses anymore, right? We are without excuse. Every single one of us has the opportunity to do the right thing. And of course, a lot of time that takes time. We don't have Ruth's whole backstory. Perhaps Ruth had to climb out of these things as well. But we do see Ruth being in the place where she needs to be, regardless of where she came from. So that's point number one I want to make. Point number two, let's actually get into the story. So we see that Ruth and Naomi are living in Moab with their husbands. But sadly, Naomi's husband dies, Ruth's husband dies, and then Orpah's husband dies. So all three men in their family are now all of a sudden gone. And it seems like it happens relatively quickly, maybe in the same year that they lose everything. And so as they do this, Naomi and Ruth, they lose everything, and Naomi is in complete despair. Naomi basically just does not want to live anymore. And very understandable, if you lose your husband and then two of your only sons within the same time period, how are you going to feel? Well, you're going to feel like Naomi does here in 1:11. Look at 1:11. Here she's talking to Ruth and Orpah about what's happened. But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go. For I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having no husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." They lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, and Ruth clung to her. Also, if you look down in verse 19, 19 says, and the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem, and it happened that when they came to Bethlehem, that all the city was excited because of them. What the woman said, is this Naomi? But she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? That Naomi is in the lowest place that she can possibly be. And to be blunt about it, who she's blaming? She's blaming God for this. Now, what she doesn't know is she doesn't know that God has a lot of big plans in store to redeem her yet. Naomi doesn't know the full story. We do, and we can look at this and say, this is awful. But Naomi doesn't have the full picture. But Naomi, in her lowest despair, doesn't even want people to call her Naomi anymore. She wants people to call her Mara, which describes the despair that she's in. She's in an awful place, but again, she will be redeemed. Naomi then tells her daughters-in-law to leave. She says, there's no way I can provide you with another husband. You can't be part of my family anymore. I also can't take care of you. You need to go home, and you need to go back to your homes, and you need to go try to find new husbands. And we've already read it, but in 14, they lift up, they weep when Orpah and Ruth are told to leave. And it says that Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to your people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. That she tells them to go. And in Ruth and Orpah's situation, it would have been to their benefit to go. Naomi can't take care of them. And as well, they really have no responsibility towards Naomi. If we said that Naomi was Ruth's mother, we could have a conversation about how Ruth has a responsibility towards Naomi. Even if Naomi was still Ruth's mother-in-law, or maybe Ruth had a child through Naomi's son, and maybe Naomi was a grandchild, we could have some serious conversation about how they're still really related and they do have a responsibility towards each other. However, that's not the case in any of these situations. Ruth does not owe Naomi anything. Ruth could have left, but she does not leave, does she? We make the point here that by Ruth clinging to Naomi, she clings to someone who cannot give her anything in return. And I remember a couple of years ago, we talked about a sermon I called it above average kindness. And we went to the things that John the Baptist started and the things he started teaching when he's saying, if you have 2 cloaks, give it to one who has none. If a soldier comes and asks you to go with him 1 mile, go ahead and go with him 2 miles. And we talked about how Jesus and God asked us to do what's above average to show in our kindness in this way. And I would suggest that Ruth staying with Naomi is above average kindness. Ruth doesn't owe Naomi anything, and yet Ruth is going to dedicate her life to taking care of Naomi. And we look and it's great to take care of our mothers. Obviously, it's commanded that we take care of our mothers. It's great to take care of our fathers. It's commanded that we do that. But have we ever gone looking for people that are not our mothers and our fathers and see what needs we can meet for them? Have we done that? Because Ruth certainly has. And that's something that we can do. We can be looking for people that maybe don't have children to take care of them, and we can go and meet their needs in that way. That would be the Ruth type of attitude that we see here with Naomi. This is not something she has to do, and yet they travel to Bethlehem, and Ruth goes looking for food to feed Naomi and herself. We see there's a theme in here that God keeps on taking care of these people. And every time these people see something good happen, they give God credit for what happens. So when they come back to Bethlehem after Ruth saying, entreat me not to leave you, in verse 16, turn back from following after you, for wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. When you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. And you see this extreme amount of dedication. And the women decide to travel back to Bethlehem for 2 reasons. One, the famine in Judah is over. And of course, Bethlehem is in the tribe of Judah. So they're able to go back and search for food. As well as we see later, Naomi owns land in Bethlehem. So Naomi is going to have the opportunity to sell that land to hopefully feed her and Ruth for a little while. So it's a better opportunity to move to Bethlehem, and they do that in chapter 2, verse 1. There was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth, and his family was Elimelech. His name was Boaz. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, Please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, Go, my daughter. And then Ruth goes to glean in the fields and hope to get food for her and Naomi. Ruth comes to Boaz's field to glean in Bethlehem. And what we see is that, go back one. What we see here in this story is that as they go back to Bethlehem, Ruth begins doing the things that the law gave her the ability to do as a poor person. If we read back in Leviticus, there were laws about your field, right? So you didn't have charity back then in the sense that you could just give somebody money. There wasn't some tax system. You couldn't get on welfare. That wasn't the situation. So God set up a plan. And that plan was when you had your field, for one thing, you did not reap the corners. You left the corners up in their stalks, in this case barley, and then the poor people could come back later and they could take the corners. Another law that was required, that when you accidentally dropped some barley or some wheat while you were gathering, you had to leave it on the ground so that the poor people could walk behind you and they could pick it up. And this is the way that you could feed yourself. You take the barley and you could grain it up, you could ground it up into grain. And when you ground it up into grain, you could cook it and you could make bread. And this is what they ate. You mostly lived on a diet of wine, water, and bread. And that was okay. That was the life then. And when you have this life, you have people like Ruth that are going to be going from field to field looking for food that they can take home. And Ruth's, of course, out there looking for Naomi. Let me summarize the story in chapter 2, because I am kind of concerned about time this morning. In chapter 2, Ruth goes to Boaz's field to glean, and she's going and she's picking things up. Boaz comes home, and he sees Ruth out there. And he asks his servants, who is she? Now, I don't know if there was a sense of attraction here, and I don't know exactly how this is all going to work, but we can say one thing about this chapter. Boaz is interested. He's interested in knowing who she is, at least. And her servants end up telling him, this is Ruth, and they give him a brief story about what she is doing for her mother-in-law, Naomi, and how he's taking care of her. And Boaz is impressed with the love and compassion and loyalty that Ruth is showing this woman, Naomi. So Boaz starts telling his servants to do things for Ruth, as in purposely dropping things so Ruth can come and pick them up. And as the day progresses in chapter 2, Ruth is going to come to him, and Boaz is going to say, this is what I want you to do. Number one, I only want you to come and harvest from my field. Don't go looking somewhere else. Don't go somewhere else where we can't see you and protect you. Because, by the way, guys, we have a woman that's just walking around in a field in the middle of the country. It's not the safest thing, is it? But Boaz says, you stay here. Number two, you stay with my young women that are also working in the field. You stay with them. If you need something to drink, you go to my water pump and you get you something to drink. You need to take a break, you can go into my house and you go take a break. The young men, I've told them not to mess with you. They're not going to talk with you. They're not going to touch you. They're going to stay away from you. So that's what you're going to do here, Ruth. And Ruth falls down on her face, and we'll cover this in the next point because I want to talk about Boaz being the Redeemer. But she praises Boaz for taking care of her and says, what have I done to deserve this? As we get to the evening in chapter 2, Boaz gets Ruth to actually start reaping from the bundles that they've already made. So they've gone in there and they've harvested it, and you'll see it outside. We still have a little bit of country here in Birmingham, but you'll be driving down the road and you'll see the bales of hay, right? And kind of think that idea with this barley, that they would make bushels of this barley and they would leave it in one place and they would come back with a wagon and pick it all up later. Well, they actually let Ruth go to the things that they've collected for themselves, and they let Ruth take some of that too. So Ruth's getting it wherever she wants to get it. That night, they decide to eat dinner together, and Boaz invites Ruth to come and eat with him. Verse 14 of chapter 2. Now Boaz said to her at mealtime, come here and eat of the bread. Dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she ate and was satisfied and kept some back. Number one, I always make this point. Young ladies, you ever go on a date, and your date takes you to Macaroni Grill, and they have the bread, and there's the vinegar that they put out, and your date tells to you, come here and eat the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar? That guy right there is probably a keeper. For one, he knows his Old Testament. And if you can quote the book of Ruth on your date, that's a pretty solid guy. So you can give him credit for that, number one. Every time I do a young people's class, Ruth usually gets covered, and I always talk about how people are always looking for their Boaz, and people are always looking to Ruth. Well, where do you got to be looking for your Boaz or looking for your Ruth? Well, you need to be in the field working. And if you're out there and you're participating in the harvest, that's going to be a good place to find your Boaz or find your Ruth. And then Boaz is going to get the opportunity to invite you to Macaroni Grill. And you can go and you can dip your bread in the vinegar and you can enjoy a dinner with somebody nice. Now, for one, we take that out of 14, but I want to bring out this point at the end of the verse. The verse at the end of verse 14 says she ate and was satisfied and kept some back. What Ruth was doing while they were eating was she was having one for her and she was putting one in her pocket. And she's getting a piece of bread and she eats one for her and she puts one in her pocket. Why is Ruth doing this? For Naomi. So even though Ruth has had this wonderful day, exciting day, and all these great things have happened to her, where is Ruth's heart? It's back with Naomi at home, isn't it? And she's keeping this food back for Naomi because even though all these great things have happened, she has not forgotten her responsibilities. And what a lesson for us today. Because we're going to go out into life, especially maybe that some of us are young, and we're going to maybe go to college. We might go and get this great career. We might go and get this great job, whatever it may be. But where does our heart need to be? And of course, I could talk about our family and the needs we need to meet there at home. And that's a good point, that our heart needs to be back there with the people that took care of us. And if there's ever a need that comes, we need to come and meet that need. But I want to propose a different one to you. Where your heart needs to be is with your Father who made you. And as we're going out and we're living our exciting lives, and things are going good for us, and things are going wonderful for us, and things are getting a lot better than they were like Ruth, our heart needs to be with our Father. And what we need to be doing is taking some of that life and then getting some and saving it for our Father. And getting our life and enjoying some of that life, and then getting some of that life and saving it for our Father. Because that's where our heart really needs to be. If we have that loyalty like Ruth had for Naomi, we have that for our Father in heaven, things are going to work out a lot much better for us in the long run. If we finish up the story here in chapter 2, she ends up taking an ephah in verse 17 back home. And an ephah is about 6 gallons of grain. So if you think about like a Home Depot bucket or a Lowe's bucket, if you made it a little bit bigger, that would be about an ephah. So now we have Ruth, and she's coming home, and she's got this big old bucket of barley. And she gets excited, and she gets to go see Naomi. Naomi says that she's blessed that she was able to do this. And Naomi notices one thing is that she went and got this from the field of Boaz. Naomi conducts a plan. Well, Boaz is actually one of our distant relatives. And being that Boaz, not distant, close, a close relative, since Boaz is a close relative, he does have a responsibility to take care of Naomi and Ruth. For instance, we go back to the old law. If I was someone and I married someone, I could not just die and leave my wife just to survive for herself. That's not what a family could do. We can do that in this time of age, but you could not do it back then. So it would be my brother's responsibility to marry my wife after I've died to make sure that she can survive and that all of her needs are met. If I didn't have a brother, well, I could go to a cousin, and a cousin would come, and they would make sure to marry the woman so that she could be taken care of. Naomi realizes that Boaz can perhaps meet this responsibility. She tells Ruth to go to his house, to lay down at his feet, and to tell him, by the way, you are a close relative of my husband. You have a responsibility to take care of me in this way. You have a responsibility to marry me. And so Boaz is going to agree. This is how Boaz ends up becoming Ruth and Naomi's redeemer. And that's the word that's going to be used in chapter 4. In chapter 2, if we go back here, just to go back, and we're going to pick up back with Boaz, we see that Boaz talks to Ruth and gives God credit for the things that are happening to her right now. We see Naomi give God credit for the bad things that happen, but Boaz is going to show how there's actually a lot of great things that God's making happen for Ruth and Naomi. In verse 10 here, this is when Ruth realizes what Boaz is doing for her. It says that she fell on her face, bowed to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes? And you have taken notice of me, since I'm a foreigner." And Boaz answered and said to her, "It has been fully reported to me all that you have done for the mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother in the land of your birth, and you have come to a people whom you did not know before. The Lord repay your work. A full reward will be given to you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Boaz says, because of your love for Naomi, because of the service that you're putting in, the Lord is going to repay you because you came and you took refuge with his people. So Boaz gives credit to God and actually quotes one of Moses' psalm that you have come underneath his wings to take refuge, and now God's going to take care of you. And just notice one thing to remind you of one thing real quick. Ruth is a Gentile. And yet Ruth is coming in here, and we see that Ruth is going to be able to participate with God's people because she wants to be a part of it, and because she wants to serve, and because she wants to show this loyalty. This might have something to do with who Boaz's mother was. And when we look at Matthew and we see the genealogy and see who Boaz's mother was, it was Rahab the harlot, who was a Gentile who joined God's people because of her faith. Now Boaz, having experienced that with his mother, is now seeing this woman who's a Gentile who wants to leave her people to join God's people, and he's saying the Lord's going to reward you and he's going to take care of you because you have taken shelter underneath his wings. So Boaz is able to see what's really happening here and takes knowledge of it. Boaz agrees to marry Ruth. When Ruth comes back later and she lays at his feet, Boaz agrees to do this. However, Boaz has realized there might be a problem. And that problem is that there's a closer relative. And there might be someone that has more of a right to marry Ruth than he himself does. If you look in verse 9 of chapter 3. Verse 9 of chapter 3, you see the conversation between Ruth and Boaz that night later on. And he said, Boaz, who are you? So she answered, I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you a close relative. Then he said, Blessed are you, the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, and that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you of your requests, for my people in my town know that you are a virtuous woman. Now it is true that I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. So he has to first check with this other relative if he has the right to marry Ruth. But we can ask this question, does Boaz want to marry Ruth? I think he does. And you look at the way that he describes her. He says, you are a virtuous woman. And the whole town knows about it. And then as well, he says, you didn't go after the young men. You didn't go after rich men. You didn't go after all this. You're here at my doorstep, asking me to marry you. So I take that for one, Boaz knows that he's not really poor and he's not rich either. He's kind of there in the middle. But he can meet Ruth's needs. However, Ruth wants Boaz. Boaz realizes that what he sees attractive about Ruth is her virtue. And he understands that Ruth is looking at Boaz. And what does Ruth see attractive about Boaz? His virtue. And the virtue of each one is what's put at the pivotal point of their relationship. That right there is a holy and a great relationship. That these two people care about the same things. Not that Ruth and Boaz are perfect. They're not perfect. They make mistakes. However, they do care about doing the right thing. And that's the reason why I believe that Boaz really wants this to happen. So, he gives Ruth more barley and he goes into town. Look here in verse 16. It says she lay at her feet, verse 14. So she lay at his feet until morning, and she arose before one and recognized another. Then he said, do not let it be known, for the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the shawl that is on you and hold it. And when she held it, he measured 6 ephahs of barley, and he laid it on her. Then she went into the city. When she came to her mother-in-law, is that you, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her. And she said, this 6 ephahs of barley he gave me, for he said to me, do not go empty-handed to your mother-in-law. Then she said, sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out, for the man will not rest until he's concluded the matter this day. So now Boaz has kind of snuck her out because he doesn't want her virtue to be messed up, does he? He wants her just to leave. Now, they didn't do anything. All they did was, looks like it's just they sat up and talked. Because obviously they're going to get married. There's a lot to talk about. So he makes sure that Ruth's able to leave. But when she leaves, what does he give her? 6 ephahs of barley. Just to hold her over for the rest of the day. 6 ephahs of barley is like 6 Lowe's buckets of barley. And what is Ruth going to do? She's going to carry this into town to Naomi. Now, for one, I can say this. Ruth was a strong woman. If she can carry 6 ephahs of barley, that's impressive. And she's able to walk and carry this into town. The second thing I like to bring up about this is, what do you think Naomi's face was like when Ruth showed up with 6 ephahs of barley and said that she's probably getting married pretty soon? Naomi's having a great day, isn't she? And you look at Naomi of all the problems and the sorrow and the heartache she was in chapter 1, and you look at her in chapter 3, and look where she's at. She is overjoyed because of the blessings that God is bringing her. And God is bringing these blessings through Boaz. So Naomi says in verse 18 that Boaz will not rest until he's figured this out. If either he can get this other man to marry Ruth, or Boaz himself can marry Ruth. I'm going to kind of skip chapter 4 a little bit, but Boaz is able to redeem Naomi and Ruth's land. Now in Leviticus 25:25, it says, if one of your brethren becomes poor and has sold some of his possession, and his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, that he may redeem what his brother has sold. So that close relative that comes in to marry can redeem the land that might have been sold to help the mother or the man meet ends until that redeeming process can happen. So what Boaz has to do is he has to ask about Naomi's land when he goes into town. So he goes into Bethlehem and he gets 10 elders so they can witness all this, and he gets his other relative. To kind of sum things up, we can just read verse 4. This is Boaz talking to the close relative. Verse 4, he says, and I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you. And he said, I will redeem it. At first, Boaz and this close relative are just talking about Naomi's land. And he's saying, you need to go buy back this land for Naomi. And first the relative agrees. I will go buy it back. I will go redeem it. And I'm going to get this land back to Naomi. And what I think happens next is Boaz also includes, by the way, you also have a responsibility to marry Ruth. And once the close relative realizes that he's got to marry Ruth, he begins to worry about his inheritance. And I'm not exactly sure how this all works, and I don't feel like it's worth getting into it unless we were like in a Bible class fashion, and I could spend a whole 45 minutes on chapter 4. So I'm going to just kind of skip over that. But once he realizes he has to marry Ruth, he worries about his inheritance, and he says, no, Boaz, you should do it. You should redeem the land, and you should redeem Ruth. So Boaz is able to go back home and marry Ruth, and they go and do that. Who is the redeemer of this story? Boaz is the redeemer. He goes and he buys back what used to belong to Naomi and to Ruth. He is the redeemer, therefore he is the Jesus figure. One thing that I liked about this is Naomi says that he will not rest until he gets it done. Meaning that Boaz wasn't going to go in town and go get something to eat first. Boaz wasn't going to, procrastinate and just see, okay, when I get the time, I'll figure out about Ruth and Naomi's situation. Because they're rotting away on the street corner, aren't they? Does Boaz have the time to go beat around and not do anything? No, he does not rest until he gets it done. And to bring it to our Redeemer today, do you think our Redeemer rests? Do you think he takes a break? Do you think if Andrew comes up and he says, I need to be redeemed, and I want to go into the waters of baptism, and I want to repent, and I want to live my life for you, is Jesus going to say, why don't you come back and do it tomorrow? Or is Jesus going to say, I know you did what you needed to do, and I know you asked me to redeem you, but I'm just going to get to it next week. Jesus doesn't do that, does he? Jesus does not rest until he redeems us. And to us that haven't been redeemed yet, Jesus worries about you. And Jesus refuses to rest until he's able to redeem you. And he's still thinking about you, and he's still working on you. And he will not rest until he redeems, just like Boaz does. Here's my fourth point. Let's talk about Ruth's legacy. Boaz is able to marry Ruth, and we see that they're going to have a child. When this all happens, some of the women come into Naomi, and they give this blessing to Naomi at the very end of verse 14 of chapter 4. Verse 14, then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative. and may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. We see here, number one, and this is important, and this is the theme of Ruth. Number one, the women say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord, who has not left you." That when Naomi's husband died, the Lord was still with her. And when Naomi lost her 2 sons, guess what? The Lord was still with her. And when Ruth went out and met Boaz in the field, the Lord was still with Naomi and Ruth then too. The Lord made a way. And he protected and preserved his people. So blessed be the name of the Lord that this all happened. He deserves all the credit for what we saw in this book. The second person that's blessed is that Boaz is, because Boaz restored Naomi and Ruth's life. So first, blessed be the name of the Lord, and now blessed be the Redeemer who restored you. Thirdly, blessed be Ruth, because Ruth was better to Naomi than 7 sons. Now, of course, we could talk about the difference between women and men, especially back in the day, and you know that women just were not treated the same way as they are today. That's just a fact. It's not necessarily a good thing, but that's what the situation was. But for these women to say, Ruth is better than 7 sons, that is a big deal. And they are able to acknowledge the great things that Ruth has done for a woman that she didn't have to take care of. Yet, Ruth was greater to Naomi than 7 sons. In all of this, going back to what we saw with the food when she was holding some back, is Naomi forgotten about? Naomi is not forgotten about, is she? All these great things are happening to Boaz and Ruth, and yet Naomi is remembered. And Naomi becomes a nurse to Ruth and Boaz's first son. So Naomi is still part of the family. And you can think about this. At the beginning in chapter 1, Naomi is motherless. She's not a mother anymore. She's not a wife anymore. And all she has is a daughter-in-law. It's not even her daughter-in-law anymore that's following her around and trying to take care of her. And now she's sitting in a house in chapter 4. And she's got basically a daughter that people are saying are better than 7 sons. She basically sort of has now a son-in-law that's meeting all of her needs. And now she's got a baby in her arms. Look at the change of events that have happened from Naomi from chapter 1 to chapter 4. Why does that all happen? Well, blessed be the name of the Lord. This is what the Lord has done for Naomi. That son's name was Obed. If we kept on reading, we see that Obed fathers Jesse, and Jesse fathers David. I love to read this book with people that have not read Ruth before, but they know a little bit about David, because you read this whole story, and there at the end you get that kicker. By the way, this whole story was about David's great-grandmother. And this is how David got to be there. And of course, we could continue on because we know a little bit more that David will be an ancestor both to Mary and Joseph. And who will Mary have? Mary will have Jesus. Ultimately, we get Jesus because of this story. If I go all the way back to chapter 1, we have a little line in there that Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem. Why was Jesus born in Bethlehem? Well, because it was the city of David. Why was Bethlehem the city of David? Because Ruth and Naomi decided to travel back to Bethlehem. That is why our Messiah was born. Our Redeemer was born in Bethlehem because of this story. And so hopefully this has been beneficial to you, and you see the legacy of Ruth, and you just see how much compassion and loyalty can go such a long way when the Lord is with us and working for us. And He will preserve us and take care of us in all the ways that He wills to do. Thank you for your close attention. If anyone here this morning needs to be redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, and you need Boaz, our Jesus, to come to you and to redeem you, because like He did for Ruth and Naomi, He wants to restore your life. He wants to make your life the way that He created it to be. If there's any way we as a congregation can assist you with that, please come forward as we stand and as we sing. I gave my